And so really it's a book about how we can better understand the planet and better understand ourselves through many of the kind of new and exciting data sets that are being collected. And we use this word invisible because often data and maps and graphics enable us to see things that we can't easily see.
Welcome to Coffee and Geography, where my guests and I geek out about the world and everything on it, discovering that we are all geographers in some way, shape or form. I am your host, Kit, and my pronouns are they, them or she, her. So settle down with a brew, hit that subscribe or follow button, and enjoy the listen. Hi everybody, welcome to Coffee and Geography, and I am joined by someone I've had the absolute privilege to collaborate with, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, well, mostly this episode. I want to welcome James Cheshire, Professor James Cheshire, to the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on.
So, James, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a professor of geographic information and cartography in the geography department at UCL. And so I guess I spend my life doing three different things. I obviously teach students, undergraduates and master's students, and I teach courses in cartography and data visualization as well as statistics and data analysis. Another part of my job is research, so kind of funded research projects, and I'm particularly interested in new types of data and what they can tell us about the future of our high streets and consumer data sets and consumer behaviours. And then the last part is I kind of am responsible for a thing called the Social Data Institute, which is all about kind of doing more social data science amongst undergraduates and postgraduates, and then my colleagues. And then, across all those things, I then try and fit in writing, co-authoring books of maps and graphics.
Yeah, wonderful. So you mentioned a few bits there. So what we'll do, everybody, we'll put some links in the description for you, so you can have a good explore of all those things. Because what we're here to talk about is mostly that latter bit, because that's how we came to meet. Is that I got an email from the Geographical Association saying that we have this this professor who authors these wonderful books. And the latest one that was written with yourself and all the graphics illustrations by Oliver Uberti is called Atlas of the Invisible. So we'll come to that in a second. But before we do, it's always tradition on this podcast to tell us a little bit about what you've got in that mug of yours that you're sipping from. So what brew have you got with you?
So I'm a coffee drinker. I don't like tea in a sort of traditional builder's tea sense. I'm not a fan of that, but I might occasionally have the odd herbal tea. But I'm a coffee drinker through and through. And of course, I live in northeast London, and I probably live within a mile of about 5 coffee roasters. So I have a good selection of artisanal coffees that I either get posted to me every couple of weeks, or I sort of go out in search of. So I'm a real, I'm the caricature of a kind of northeast London hipster potentially. I'm a real coffee snob.
Oh, hipster. Well, actually, we'll come back to that like later on because of the word that our previous guest gave. For we are all geographers. What's your? Do you have a favorite brand? I mean, we name drop brands not for promotion, but we do it for our guests and their students to challenge them on sustainability, do a bit of inquiry. So what's your go to usually?
Oh, that's a really good question. So there's quite a lot. One of the ones that's really taken off around here lately is called Perky Blenders, and they've been growing. And then we've got there's Wood Street Roasters, and then there's Minor Figures, which some people may have seen. They roast up the road, so they're all small batch kind of roasters, and a lot of them are organic or definitely kind of fair trade organic, and so that's something that is quite important actually, the sustainability aspect. And it's been very interesting in recent last couple of years. I mean, the price of coffee is really gone up due to sort of various climatic factors and things, and so that's very noticeable. So, these things aren't bags of coffee aren't as cheap as they used to be, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But as I say, if you're someone like me that drinks a lot of it, it does soon adds up.
It adds up, yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, sustainability, a very, very good segue into then Atlas of the Invisible, which is an absolute beautiful, beautiful publication, and I have no qualms on this podcast at all to give it a really good plug, because that is what's going to be the meat of the conversation. So yourself and I recorded some video chats regards to that book and what it was all about and what it means and the messages and everything like that. So to introduce, so we're going to play some of this video through audio, because it's don't worry, it's podcast friendly, everybody. So you can enjoy it while you're commuting or everything like that. So James, would you like to introduce us to what Atlas of the Invisible is, and we will then get them folks to listen.
Yeah, thanks, Kit. And it was great. Our conversations, I think, in November were kind of a really nice way to get me thinking a bit more about the book and, the impact it can have and so on. And so really it's a book about how we can better understand the planet and better understand ourselves through many of the kind of new and exciting data sets that are being collected. And we use this word invisible because often data and maps and graphics enable us to see things that we can't easily see. So it may be that we can take a historic data set. So we've got historic whaling, for example. That's something we can't see today, but we can digitize whaling ship logs, and it can reveal kind of the patterns that existed during that time. We can think about things that might happen in the future, so climate change projections. And again, that's not visible today, but the maps and graphics may show us a future that we might be living through. And similarly, there's lots of contemporary issues that are hard to imagine, or if you just look out the window and think, and see them in one big picture. But we can, again, use a map to really zoom out of something or zoom into something and reveal patterns that are otherwise hard to see. So that's really what we try and do in the book. And hopefully, we've got some kind of interesting and exciting examples of that. That I'm a geographer, and I picked topics that were of interest to me, and hopefully they'll be interest to other geographers out there as well.
That's I fully I can't say no more than that, really. So everybody, here you go. Here's James and I having a conversation back in November regards to various things about Atlas the Invisible, a little bit of context to it all and its contents. So do enjoy. When you made me aware of this book that you were writing, I had to jump at the chance and get the chance to work with you. And it is so timely because maps, of course, are ubiquitous through geography education at all phases. But at secondary education in particular, it's usually OS maps or survey maps, and how do we integrate those kind of basic map skills? But of course, they tell so much more. There's a narrative behind them, the reason why you develop the map, what story are they telling, how does the person looking at that map draw a narrative for themselves? And so, I'm looking forward to hearing about your thoughts about why you felt the need to go about this with this book, and perhaps how you hope it will be applied in an educational setting.
Yeah, thanks, Kit. So I think one of the most exciting things about this working on this project, but actually looking at sort of geography overall at the moment, is there's a tremendous amount of material available for mapping and map making, and there's a huge amount of potential for using it in kind of new and exciting ways. And that's really what this book is about, but actually about my work in general. It's about taking maps away from using them as a tool to find out where a river is or a mountain or something like that, and creating stories and narratives from data. And it's something that I think atlases are uniquely placed to do.
Yeah, and atlas skills is something that any geography educator listening will that will ring a bell with them. And they're beautiful pieces of art, I feel, atlases, beautiful pieces of artwork. And but maps are still seen as a skill,
in terms of, what we can categorise what students need to learn, as they're in that skill bracket, but they really should be in that bracket of narrative. They really should be in that bracket of being a curriculum artefact, being a stimulus. And this is what I really, really enjoy about what you are doing with these visualizations. One particular map which really, really kind of gives a sense of power towards me is something called bombshell reports. So can you tell me a little bit about how that speaks to you as a map of not power, but also it speaks as a map of showing power through time, perhaps? Because maps are a static thing, it seems like, but actually they can be a temporal measure as well.
Yeah. So bombshell reports is something. I'll just turn to the page now. But it started off as a story about the U.S. bombing of Vietnam. So there's this historic data set that actually spans every war since the First World War, which is shows historic sorties, they're called, but missions that US Air Force planes flew. And they used to be marked on paper maps. It used to be that, the pilots would come back and mark on the map where they'd been and what their target was. And then these data sets got digitized. So actually they became a digital resource. And they were still classified in the most part. But actually in the year 2000, Bill Clinton released the classified information for the Vietnam War. And the reason he did this was because the US actually had a secret bombing campaign of Cambodia. Now, obviously, the people in Cambodia were aware of it because they've been suffering the consequences since through unexploded bombs that have been killing and injuring people for the decades since the war. But the kind of US population, it was considered a state secret that this bombing ever happened. And so the data got released in order to help people locate where the most intensive bombing happened, and so that they could then go and search for the unexploded ordnance. Right. And it was a real surprise to me because I hadn't heard about this Cambodia bombing. So when I first opened the data set, I could see that there was this bombing in Cambodia. And so the job became, how do we tell that story in such a way that people can relate the data points, the dots, to the missions and the things that were happening at the time. And so we had to do a huge amount of research to understand how the data was structured, even what the different missions were. It's called Operation Menu, they're sort of named after meals. And so the power of the map, and actually we actually make a bigger one here, fold it out, so that we can mark on it where the different bombs fell, depending on these missions. So we had breakfast, dinner, dessert, snack, supper, were these missions along particular roads that the US Army were targeting. And so actually we combined that story with another story which is about a siege that happened to US troops within Vietnam, Battle of Khe Sanh, which is this celebrated, for want of a better word, battle within US military history where this US base was under siege. And it turned out that around that base became the most heavily bombed part on the planet. And so we had a challenge. We had to come up with a way of telling a story over a longer time period across a whole country, and then people can turn the page, and then we had to zoom right into a specific event and add narration and things like that to help tell that story. And so there's a big kind of iceberg of work that went into this, and the trick is using things like arrows and annotation to help pull out what's happening.
Yeah, and it's really, really interesting how you've gone about mapping this, because as we said, this is really a temporal map, as well as a geolocation spatial map. So, for example, I took a little bit of a naming bombing campaigns after snacks, after meals. That in itself, displaying that, almost the inhumanity of it. But of course, going on it completely now analytical in terms of a temporal scale, they are temporal time stamps, aren't they? They're breakfast, and then depending on, some people say dinner and supper, whatever way around. But then you've got the temporal according to those campaigns there. And then the way that you've done this in terms of your geolocation points, you've got Operation Menu, which you've done in yellow, which was not, the campaign in 1969 to 1970. Then Operation Freedom Deal, you've got that in orange, and you've got that in red. And of course, as you've just already mentioned, you've got that zoomed in function where you've got, you've done the same sort of thing where you've done it by month and gone really. So you've not just zoomed in spatially, you've zoomed in temporally as well. So explain to me why you decided to go about it.
Yeah, well, that was one of the big kind of features of one of the big not features, but one of the biggest kind of revelations was that we originally had our points coloured by time in a generic sense. Between January and March, March to May and so on. But then Oliver, who designed the book as the co-author, he said, well, look, the trouble is the colours of your points are not lining up with these key moments in the campaign. So what you need to do is you've got to go back and you've got to recolour all of them to fit these distinctive moments in the history. And then as soon as you do that, the picture emerges. And so it's a good example of where thinking about how you can use colour, goes beyond just saying, well, these are sort of, equal time periods that we're going to use colour for the particular points. Is actually using the colour to help really tell that story.
And that's one thing that I noticed actually is that in classic mapping, I guess, you've got very stratified data categorization. So you would have, it's almost frowned upon that it must be 3 months, 3 months, 3 month segments or something like that. But yeah, absolutely, it's purely to the narrative rather than to the temporal space.
Exactly,
and
right.
you can quite clearly see from the map, how the campaign switched from the east and then really did focus over towards, the west along the river. So that's really, really powerful visualization in that respect. And I'd like to focus a little bit more on power. I mentioned it at the top, that these things can have huge amounts of power and they can show the inequality of power. And I just go, one thing that comes to my mind, and you actually mention in your teaching when you do your teaching, is, for example, the 1884 Berlin Conference. How a single stroke of a pen, with these people, these colonial powers in Berlin, decide that this is where the countries of Nigeria and this is where Cameroon's going to be, completely dissecting, the tribes in the Niger Delta area, for example. And that's just one element of how cartography and geography is used as a tool of power. And one thing that I've read quite substantially when I do these kind of things is Painter and Jeffrey. They've got their political geography of 2009, their publication, and they opine that cartography and even geography, the concept of geography itself, is a tool of colonialisation, and therefore us as geographers, from your sense and from my sense as a ex-geography teacher, we have to be responsible that we have this innate power because we are teachers and educators of geography. We promote geography. So I really do want to talk about this. So one thing about the book and its structure is something that, because we mentioned atlases and things like that. And the title of your book, of course, is Atlas, is that you give a lot of historical context and preamble and examples at the start of each chapter to tell a narrative before you go into the maps. And one of those things that you look into quite extensively is the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. And you seem to, by the way that you write and the stories that you tell from it, you seem to have a lot of affection for Du Bois and his work, as an African-American sociologist and a kind of the activism that he did. So yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about why you have such affection for Du Bois and his work.
I first kind of discovered Du Bois's work through the resurgence of an interest in the data visualizations that he had created, particularly for this 1900 Paris exposition. And he and his students kind of by hand created these boards, which were then displayed in Paris as part of this big exposition that was happening. And that work has all been kind of digitized, and there's a brilliant book that contains that information. What I hadn't fully appreciated, and this is partly a symptom of the way that sort of sociological teaching is done, and thinking about concepts in sociology and who came up, who came up with them, and the kind of general whitewashing of that history, is that Du Bois was a real pioneer in the collection of data about the African American population, particularly in the US, around the time of the 1900s period. And the power of his work was, for me, and the connection for me, was that he realized that data was being used against people like him, because it was predominantly focused on the white population, and it was catering for the white population's needs, and it was being used to create the horrendous stereotypes and so on that in the Jim Crow South and things like that were going on. And so for Du Bois, he realized that data offered power in order to better represent the communities that were not properly represented. He actually, Alden Morris, who wrote a brilliant biography of Du Bois's scholarly work and sees him as a founder of sociological thinking, that's combined, that sort of empirical analysis is actually then combined with a very strong kind of political and politicization of his work, because I think he realized, and he says that data alone was not enough. In fact, he says here, one could not be a cool, calm, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, and so he witnessed and seen lynchings happening, and he also says that he assumed that there would be demand for the scientific work that he was doing, but of course he was being isolated from his work because he was creating hard truths for the people in power. And there's work that he did, what he described as his greatest sociological work, was actually destroyed. I mean, he did this massive survey, and it was destroyed because it was not considered sort of in line with the political thinking at the time. And so he was operating. I mean, he had an incredibly long life. But in the early part of his career, he was operating at a time when there were a lot of other developments. So they were trying to bring in an anti-lynching bill in the best chance they had was around the 1920s. And that was another brilliant example of what we would today consider sort of data journalism. So there's someone called Ida B. Wells, and there were others, particularly women's groups, working, collecting data on lynchings and where African Americans had been killed by white mobs. And the argument against legislation was always, this is a local issue. Your local legislators need to stop this. It's not a national issue. So we're going to keep it at arm's length. And the brilliance of their work was demonstrating that it was a national issue, and that the maps that they created could be used to articulate that it's a national problem, it needs national legislation, and then they use those maps to try and kind of leverage politicians into voting for an anti-lynching bill. Sadly, they didn't get it through, and even to this, the most shocking thing is to this day there isn't actually any bill in the US that explicitly outlaws lynching. So whilst ultimately they didn't achieve their objective, particularly in the 1920s, which is when they were pushing hardest for this, I think that the mapping and the data collection that was created at the time is incredibly, is both inspirational but also informative in the way that we should go about our work today. And it's not present enough on what we teach from school level, but also through to the kind of university level in map making, cartography, and data visualization and things like that. It's not just that, Du Bois created some nice infographics. It's actually the work that went into them to get the robust data collected, the hard graft, in order to create the data sets that could then be visualized. One of the long-term consequences of maps that again we can overlook, but I think we should acknowledge more, is that maps created less than well within the last century, but potentially forgotten, are still having big impacts on the built environment or our perceptions of particular areas and things like that. And so the redlining example is a perfect case in point, where actually areas were effectively condemned as not being safe for investment, for homeowners loans, for all that kind of stuff, and so they weren't invested in. And so people thought, well, we'll just put a freeway down the middle of this one, or we won't plant the trees, or put in the public parks that we need, and all that kind of stuff. And so those are the built environment characteristics that are now impacting cities in a warming world, because of course we need, trees provide fantastic shade for people in heat waves. That the more concrete you have, the more reflective heat you have, the more heat that gets stored, all those kinds of problems. And so a map may be printed out in front of you, but really its power can often be seen by the decisions that are taken from it, and then the stuff that's been built as a result of that cartographic representation.
Yeah, and it's not just the impacts of heat. When I was working out in San Francisco, I spoke to a group called Up Marin, and that's the county of Marin, just to the north of the city of San Francisco, and they are suffering these impacts in a similar way because of the way that redlining has taken place, the lack of investment, the lack of safeguarding in the built environment there, and so every time there is a king tide, that shoreline gets flooded. And the priority that the local authorities had was to build a freeway through that area, rather invest in a freeway, so people could get to and from the city of San Francisco a lot easier through the north, through Marin, rather than investing in safeguarding those communities. So that is a story I heard from the local activists just a few years ago, and it's an issue. Of course, it's getting worse because of rising sea levels and climate change.
I mean, I think one note of optimism is that we now have more data available to us that is more accessible to more people, and the tools available to create your own maps and your counter maps and things like that. And I think using those to leverage or to go against prevailing power is actually quite a positive thing. And the nice thing actually about some of these data sets, of course, is that what they tell us is unequivocal in many respects. And so one of the examples we have in the book is related to the Flint water crisis, and how the city of Flint in Michigan changed its water supply to save money. It then was a different chemical composition in the water, so the lead leached out into the water and poisoned the population effectively. And some modelers at the University of Michigan actually came up with a way of pinpointing quite effectively the houses that were most likely to have lead pipes feeding them. And the city undertook quite an effective campaign of replacing those lead pipes based on that model. But the problem was some parts of the city, the more affluent ones, the ones with the newer buildings, less likely to have lead pipes, felt that they deserved their pipes checking and digging up as well. And so the political pressures meant the city abandoned the model for a time. Its success rate hugely dropped. It cost a fortune in wasted effort. And in the end, they reverted back to that original data set. And I think that some of the power in the data, is that it can call out some of these poor political decisions ultimately, and that's it's incumbent on all of us to use data in an effective way to kind of hold people to account that might otherwise prefer those data sets not be out in the public domain or something.
And I think that Flint, Michigan example is actually a good shall we call it, upgrade from the one that gets classically used in schools to show how these things can be very powerful, of course, is Jon Snow's cholera map. Of course, how simple, how just putting data points on a map and think, I think this problem is due to this pump in this street in London, and then to look at that and think, okay, this one in Flint, Michigan, you've got all these other kind of aspects and issues and nuances
actually,
around it.
the thing about snow is that is there's a bit of mythology around that map. So he actually had his theory. He knew that cholera was a waterborne disease, and he did a huge amount of data collection, contact tracing, a phrase that we hear a lot now. He established how someone in Hampstead may have died from cholera, because actually it turns out this lady was living in Soho. She so liked the water that she actually got people to bring her the water every day from the pump in Soho. And that ultimately is what killed her and made her niece ill, and snow connected those dots. And so the map was actually a further kind of elaboration or illustration that said, unequivocally, we've got more people dying around this pump. And it's a further example. But at the time it was not until after he died that people acknowledged he was right. And even up until the 1910s and 1920s, there were some parts of Europe that did not endorse the kind of waterborne view of cholera, because it held water companies to account and it cost money to upgrade the water supplies. And so again, there's some really interesting examples where cities kind of held out against the view because they knew that it would cost them too much money to upgrade their water.
And how interesting that one of the issues that's being talked about today, of course, is the release of sewage, by water companies into our rivers and oceans, and how there's a lot of citizen pressure going push back on that, especially on social media, utilising these maps and showing how all of a sudden we're now having these red flags come up to say, well, this was a beach or an area or a river or something, or a water outlet that was safe to bathe in. It actually was designated as you could bathe in it, and now because of this data that is available.
And that's another great example of like the map. I think the map has driven what I think broke that story and made it kind of a national scandal was the map that showed. I'm not sure who created it, but I definitely saw a lot of a map that was not a particularly elaborate one, but it just showed where the sewage discharges were and how many had happened at any given moment. And again, it kind of shocked people into thinking, it visualized for them a national problem that needed national action.
Right, exactly.
And so that, again, is a really nice example of the power of maps, to make a difference, I think.
So let's stick with pollution then, because one of the maps in your book is called Inexhaustive Detail, which deals with air pollution. And this is shocking. Well, we know that this has been in the news quite a fair bit as well. And, the shocking statistic that you mentioned in your book, which is 8.9 million people in 2015 were killed by air pollution, and 790,000 in Europe alone in that year. That's just a staggering number. And when I look at this through a geographical eye, I remember teaching when we talk about economic development and stuff like that. I used to have fun with the children about the Europe's hot banana, because of the shape of the way that the Industrial Revolution kind of went from southern England and then kind of spread its way through. And of course, the term hot to make it was an economic core. There was a lot of activity going from there. And when I looked at this map of showing where the poor air quality was, it does quite fit that kind of hot banana shape. And of course, and then there's the redistribution according to the weather conditions and everything like that. So that was really, really, really interesting. And then of course you've got these plumes of air pollution emanating from areas of the Middle East, from the oil-rich nations as well. So I really want to kind of think to yourself about why you thought this was this is almost more of a classic kind of style map compared to the other things that you include in the book. It really is here is the pollution that has taken place, the concentrations of this pollution of nitrogen dioxide concentrations, and here's where it is mapped over this time. So why did you decide to include this one, which is probably more closer to the classic kind of things we might show in a geography classroom?
It's good. It's a good question. I think for me, it's one of the best examples of how data collection has changed in a relatively short period of time. So if you imagine, the way that we might have collected pollution data, say, I don't know, a decade or certainly 2 decades ago, is through things like weather balloons, putting up, or, you can do street level pollution measurements and things like that. And in those cases, it was always specific locations, right? So you would have to collect some kind of specific readings around, and then you might have to use a computer model or something else like that to try and guess what the pollution levels are like between the known locations. And there'll be some parts of the world that you just don't measure. You just got no idea. Whereas thanks to this satellite, which is called Sentinel 5, it's part of the European Space Agency's Copernicus program. This thing goes overhead pretty much every day for every part of the planet, and it can get some sense of what nitrogen dioxide levels are, the ozone levels, and various other carbon monoxide, various other measurements. And it can do it for a whole area, assuming there's not too much cloud and all that kind of stuff. And it creates this kind of impartial, in the sense that it's got, the sensor is just telling us what's there, but quite powerful image of where the worst pollution is at any given moment, and how that pollution changes over time, and where it's emanating from, and so on. So pick out the oil-rich nations, parts that Lebanon's pretty one of the worst, because it's still its power stations are incredibly unclean, and then we have this kind of, as you say, arc of pollution that's coming from like the Rhine Valley and the Channel, and shipping in the Channel, and flights and so on, sitting over the British Isles during hot weather. But it also outs some other, big polluters like the cruise ship industry around Marseille. Marseille comes up with a big orange flash on it, and it often is. And that's because, cruise ships are some of the worst polluting things on the planet. And you can see the impact it's having just in that particular area. So having, this image change over time, people can look it up and see different versions of the maps and make decisions about, what needs to be done to reduce the pollution. I think was just a nice example, as you say. It's a traditional looking map, but actually it's created from very high tech data.
And this reminds me actually of a project that I was made aware of when I worked with scientists in Boulder, Colorado. So we worked for NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, and they were working on a project called the Carbon Tracker. And what the Carbon Tracker was doing was very, very similar to this, is that because it's just, as you said, impartial data, it was purely and simple setting up a sensor network based on all these kind of things, weather balloons, aircraft sampling techniques, air core systems, which is a really unique way of taking effectively the same thing as an ice core, but for air, through the way a weather balloon descends, satellite imagery, in order to track really, really accurately sources of pollution and sources of carbon dioxide in particular. And this is a way that they just generate, and of course, because they're a state-sponsored entity, they're the US government body, just a simple way of saying this is where it's coming from. Now, you policymakers, what are you going to do about it? And that kind of gives me the kind of sense about how powerful these simple kind of tracking things, all these multiple technologies come into play with this. And as you said, a way of positive use of mapping, and how to try and readdress the balance of power.
Yeah, because you can hold, you can hold governments to account, and you can actually say, whatever. France can say to Germany, well, look, we can see there's all this pollution your industry's creating, it's blowing over to us, going to do something about it, you know, and things like that. I think, you know, hopefully will provide just more intelligence to kind of how we deal with some of these challenges around pollution and global climate change and so on.
And there is precedence because, you know, going back into, you know, before we had things like Sentinel-5, of course, we had the problems that the United Kingdom's Industrial Revolution was causing to the Scandinavian nations with acid rain. And when I was learning geography at GCSE back in the 90s, that was one of the main environmental issues that we were talking about was acid rain and sulfur dioxide causing sulfur and destroying these forests over in Scandinavia because, of course, the prevailing wind coming from the southwest, and that was an issue that was sorted, you know, because they had the data a little bit, you know, not as technologically advanced as it is today, but it just goes to show how powerful it is. So we're having this chat, of course, James, during, well, COP26 is coming to an end right now. We're towards the end of it now as we're recording. And a lot of my work has been about climate anxiety and climate agency and working with schools to try and help them manage that and use climate change as a safeguarding issue. And I will strongly recommend, you know, your book as a curriculum resource, as a curriculum artifact, 100%. The question I do have to ask you, though, is that, of course, in this age of climate anxiety and something really got to be very aware of, do you feel there's anything, maybe any parts of your book or the book itself may inadvertently feed in to this anxiety, or on the flip side, where it could give us a bit of hope and change some of this anxiety into agency?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, it's something that I reflect on a lot, and actually I think back to my own geography education. So I left school in 2005, went and did a geography degree. It's 2008, and you know, that was over a decade ago. And I think back to some of the stuff I was learning at school, you know, that was maybe 15 years ago or more. And at the time, I remember, you know, as a student, I remember being terrified myself, you know, at like reading the statistics in 10 years' time, this glacier is going to go. I remember the other day, actually, I was having a clear out and I found all the preparation notes I put together for university interviews. And, you know, and I had printouts of like BBC News stories of, you know, glacial retreat and the impacts of climate change. And it really hit me because I thought, well, that was all the stuff that's written there said in 10 years time or in 15 years time, and it's all coming to pass, you know. And even if you look at old atlases, you know, in the early 90s, this stuff was in there in geography textbooks. And you know, in a sense, we were some of the first people to be taught about climate change in geography in a really serious way, I think. And that's informed my work and my interests. And then I think now, you know, kids at school are in a sense living through some of these things in a way that we haven't previously done. And that is terrifying, actually. And you can understand why there's anger and youth climate movements and so on. And so I don't want to facilitate a feeling of despair. I don't want people to think, and kids to think, oh, this is it now, you know. But I do want kids to understand that we have more data available to us, more capability of tracking the changes as they happen, understanding what may happen. You know, we've got, you know, the maps of forest fires, for example, or, you know, in the book, both show areas that have long had them, but also areas that are developing them and the impacts of that. You know, we've got data that's showing, whatever, the intensity of sea level rise in different parts of the ocean, you know, all those kinds of things we can create global level views of now in unprecedented detail. And the trick is not to say, well, I'm just going to be a kind of spectator here. I mean, the last image in the book is of what was the world's largest iceberg coming off the Antarctic Peninsula and sort of spiraling into South Georgia. And that was there because I felt like, you could either be a spectator, you could say, I'm watching this stuff happen and I'm going to do nothing, or I'm going to do something about it. And I think that that's the most important feature here. It's not a story of despair, but it is a story of saying, well, we now know what's going on. We've got more data available to us to show what's going on. And you, the politicians, you, the decision makers, need to do something about it. And I think we have seen that. I think in COP26, there is a lot more pressure now. I think politicians are feeling it, that something needs to change. And crucially, we can monitor how the pledges are going. We talked about the nitrogen dioxide, talk about nitrogen dioxide map in the book. You can now monitor that and say, well, these countries have pledged to do this thing. Well, have they are they really doing it? And I think that is empowering. And so I think, this isn't about politicizing our kids. This isn't about scaring them about the future, but this is about presenting them with the information they're going to need to navigate an uncertain world. And actually, if we can equip them with the tools and the skills and the maps and everything that help explain that information or help them to process it, then they can then use it to make sure that change happens. I think that is the crucial message here. We talk about maps having lots of power, but that power only comes from people acting on them. And so we have to combine the messaging around change and uncertainty and nervousness about the future. We must combine that messaging with ways to act, and how we can make those changes to try and prevent this future from happening.
Yeah, and the agency is the key word here. I've had a lot of debate with fellow educators about what words should we be using to change climate agency to action, or climate anxiety to action, or climate anxiety to agency. And a lot of us are coming around to this idea that agency is actually a much more nurturing word, because action is like, it gives you that kind of feeling that, well, if you're not doing something, if you're not acting, then you're part of the problem. Whereas agency is like, no, we're giving you the power to do what you feel you can do. What are you capable of doing? And actually, it's interesting what you said about the politicians at COP26. One of our colleagues who took a bunch of students up to COP26 for the UK Youth Sustainability in Schools Network said that they actually felt the politicians may have felt a bit nervous, a little bit fearful of the young people there, because they realised that we are letting these young people down, and these amazing youngsters who were taken up to COP26. Why are they so passionate? Why do they feel that they can provoke change? Why are they holding politicians and people of power to account? It's because they have the information behind them and they understand what it means. And that is what's the crucial element as us as educators. I don't see us as much as teachers and educators. I see us as allies of young people, because we can, that blame game has probably been gone. And I totally agree with you what you say about education in geography. When I was in the 90s doing my GC, it was like, global warming could be this issue. This is what could. It was always could, may. And then when I started teaching, it was, this is what is likely to happen with the elements of uncertainty. And then as I was teaching, it went from likelihood to will, or and then now it is. And that language has developed so quickly.
Yeah, so. And I think the power of actually geography and geography education as well is it enables you to connect the dots in a way that some other disciplines don't. And one of my great heroes is Humboldt, and the work that he did with maps and atlases. His collaborators, a chap named Berghaus. He made these connections, and I think that we've done a really good job of educating kids about the fact that some countries are more empowered to act than others, and you may well say, one country is going to cut its emissions, but there's no point in doing that if they're effectively exporting them to another country who's having to make the products that that country is now importing, or the importance of land ownership in better land management and understanding all these connections and stuff like that. And I think that, as you said, the idea that people are better informed, I think is crucial, because actually it calls the bluff of politicians who say it's not possible to do this, or I don't want to do that, or even it gives motivation or impetus to making decisions about, I'm someone who's empowered to, I don't know, eat less meat, or, cycle rather than drive, all those kinds of decisions. I'm not taking them in the context of my own very specific circumstances. I'm actually able to kind of extrapolate that out to the global impacts of everyone making a small change. And I think that is really important. And it's easy to it's easy to say, well, we're just going to fill our kids with despair if we do this. You're not you're not teaching it right or messaging it correctly if that is the outcome. The outcome is we have a potentially quite scary and uncertain future, but we can take some firm action and decisions to help alleviate that. And here's the data that can inform those decisions, and this is how we can facilitate change.
Absolutely, and I'm going to give someone a shout out here, someone I admire greatly, a young person called Clover Hogan, who's a young climate activist who really does give she really instills inspiration in other young people, and she actually was fortunate enough to have a platform in the blue zone of COP26 and really did call out the people in power. And she does this amazing job of making young people feel it's okay to be anxious, use that anxiety to make the changes that is comfortable for you, that you can do, but it also has this synergetic way of holding others to account. So, and she says encouraging conversation is so important. That is the first step to anything. And this is what, data like this really helps, is to go with those conversations. And so she says, when you're looking at these kind of aspects, well, like you said about products and where they come from and outsourcing emissions to places, like China, for example. And she says, well, if you have those conversations with your family, with your friends, oh, well, you okay, fine, you want this this thing, have you talked about where you could perhaps source a refurbished one, or does it have to come from this location? Where's your mum and dad banking with? Who are they, you know, what's their pension coming from? Is it invested in these kind of things? And then as soon as you put that conversation out there to everybody else, they have a great impact.
As
well, and they kind of shift the responsibility back onto those creating the biggest problems.
Yeah, I agree, and so I think we need to say this isn't about despair. This is about kind of arming ourselves with the information we need to create the change we need.
You must have had these kind of questions so many times before, but what would you like to see educators like myself be doing in the classroom? You know, when we're working with, you know, not just our secondary school students, but maybe even into, you know, the primary and early years. What would you like to see as someone who works on this on an academic front?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think, you know, in the last decade or so, since I've started teaching undergraduates, you know, I have seen a real shift, a real positive shift with our kind of first years coming in. They have a better understanding of data. Actually, they're interested in mapping and data and how that can be used in geography. They have, you know, strong awareness about kind of what's happening around the world and how, you know, things should change and how we might go about changing. So actually, there is a much stronger kind of, I wouldn't say campaigning edge to them, but I think it's no longer some, you know, they're much more active in how their knowledge can then facilitate positive change, which I think is a good thing. And I think they have a real appetite for, you know, making maps and data visualizations, because there's so much more of them now in the media. You know, COVID-19, you know, graphs are everywhere. explaining the outbreak and stuff. So, that's all really positive. I think that we can do more in teaching kids about data, the pros and the cons, the challenges, the potentials of certain data sets. Because again, I think those arguments can be somewhat one-sided at times. You often hear about all the negative side effects of data collection around ethics and privacy and that kind of thing. Less about how that can be used in more positive ways. And then in the same way, I think particularly teachers who were geography undergraduates not so long ago, or a bit longer ago, went through a geography curriculum at the undergraduate level that did not do a lot of mapping and data visualizing. It was, in the UK at least, the discipline is much more critical. So it's about the dangers of the map, or the negativities associated with the map, and
I can corroborate that. I had to do a specific module on mapping. It wasn't endemic or integrated throughout the rest of my degree.
Yeah, exactly. And if you don't have that module, you can't do it. So I can understand how for some people in the classroom, it's actually quite hard to think, well, how am I going to access this or create resources from it and so on. And so I think there's a lot out there, and I'm very committed to sharing examples and things. And I would say, start with a map that you've seen, on the BBC or The Guardian or Financial Times. They all do really great maps outputs now. And get the kids thinking about, how representative is the data that I'm using or that they've used here? Are there people missing from this map that should be represented? Asking about, is the data current? What perspectives might we be showing here? Could it be shown another way? All those sorts of questions about the kind of the critical engagement stuff, I think are really important, because then they come into university and people like me would love to teach them more about, the software, the skills, the tools to create amazing maps, but then also the dangers of mapping, but also how you can contextualize that knowledge in a way that is actually useful. And I think that's one of the real powers of geography and geographical thinking, is that you're able to contextualize what you've done, and that's something that is actually quite, I would say, quite unique to geographers, and something I would definitely, I wouldn't want to lose. I think it's really important.
Sure. And the geography teacher community in the United Kingdom in particular is amazing. They're so supportive. There's a great collaboration going on. There are so many examples of teachers and educators doing amazing things with their students, and they share them so freely as well. So they're out there to be found. And you've got subject associations like the Geographical Association, Royal Geographical Society, and all those kind of things who facilitate all of this collaboration. And so it's all out there. And the other thing that I would also say to teachers, as being one myself, is that, of course, there's that constant pressure and dread about, I've got to get through content, I've got to get through the curriculum, I've got to make sure that my kids are ready for that exam at the end of year 11, year 13 or whatever. But there are ways of integrating this into the way that you want to portray your content, the way that you want to deliver your curriculum. And it's just finding a way and picking each other's brains about, okay, how can we have our cake and eat it? Because you can use these, as we've already mentioned, as curriculum stimuli, as curriculum artifacts, as stimuli, as a way to teach the content that you need to do. And of course, very, very importantly, help develop our students' critical thinking skills as well. And even when I've got a very, very lovely memory of some students doing their old controlled assessment, and that's going to make some people watching a bit shivering when we used to do controlled assessments at GCSE coursework, using a new GIS software to produce amazing maps of the data that they collected on their fieldwork, for example. And this is coming from 15, 16-year-olds, so they can do it. They're up for it. They're up for the challenge. So let's let them off.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the software. I mean, the tools have massively changed.
Indeed.
and there's a lot more web-based tools now, which make a huge difference. So you're not having to install any complicated software to get access to maps. And it doesn't have to be hard or complicated, or even thinking about specific technical skills or anything like that. What's really important, I think, is the conversations and the, as you say, the critical thinking around being able to look at a map or a data set and to say, you know what, it's got some good stuff about it, there's some bad stuff about it. In an ideal world, it would be a bit more like this, but it's all we have, it's the best we have. So now we're going to go and move forward as best we can with the data to make some interesting decisions or observations based on it.
And what does the data not show us as well as what it does show us as well?
Exactly.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to add from a geography educator's point of view, or to teachers who are listening? Any final words of advice, perhaps?
No. I'm very enthusiastic about geography and the label geography. And one of the things, I mean, about academic geographers is they often drop that label fairly. You become a glaciologist or a geomorphologist, or in my case, my job title is geographic information and cartography, and I'm not a professor of geography, and I think taking ownership of that word, moving it away from kind of caricatures of sort of old men in tweed jackets with leather arm patches, that kind of thing, and being able to take ownership of it and actually say this is actually what geographers can bring to the world, particularly around big challenges around the climate crisis and things like that. I think is important, and I feel that it's something that that it is happening. Actually, I think there's more going on. The Geographic Association and Royal Geographical Society, I think, have been really good at pushing that word in education, and so it's about keeping it there, both in terms of the timetable, geography, curriculum content, but then embedding that geographical thinking across other subjects too.
Absolutely.
Hi folks, a chance for you to recharge your brew, but also a polite prod to remind you that it's so easy to support this podcast. Simply liking, sharing, rating and reviewing means that it will get on more people's radar. Also, there are a few links down in the description which may be of mutual benefit. Please do check them out. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed listening to that as much as I know I definitely enjoyed that conversation back down there in London in November. There are plenty of educators and geography teachers listening, James. And I think this would be a good opportunity to say that there are some educational resources that have been made to go with the book, which is what I helped you out with, and Catherine Owen, who's been a guest in this podcast back in season 1, and Paul Turner. So tell us a little bit more about the complementary kind of website and the educational resources that go with, and then where they can find that.
Yeah, so the education materials we can see, if you go to atlasoftheinvisible.com, there's a kind of a For Educators button at the top there, and then that will take you actually to my website, which has these materials on, and I guess we can post a link direct to them as well. And I really wanted to work with people like you, Kit, to come up with educational materials that support the book, because over the years I've created or co-created websites. Like one of the websites we worked on is called Data Shine, which many of you probably have used and been familiar with. And previous book, like London, the Information Capital, was the first one I did with Oliver. We know that they were and are used quite widely in schools, and there are ways to get into maps and map making. But I'm someone that doesn't have a huge amount of experience in knowing what it would be useful for teachers and educators, particularly at secondary and even primary level. And I often get requests from teachers to help out with some materials or give talks at schools and that kind of thing. And I think it's incredibly important that we invest in these resources, because I think getting kids into mapping, data, visualization is increasingly important for what they might do at university, particularly if they come and do geography. So I was keen that I get some like proper help in doing it and putting together kind of a big suite of resources that will sit alongside the book. So you don't have to have a copy of the book necessarily completely in front of you in order to use them. And they are kind of open access and free to use. But, it's good to kind of be able to follow along with the book as well. So I do hope they're useful. And they have had quite a lot of, I think we've had about 2,000 visits to the resource
Wow.
page. I just checked. So hopefully people are making good use of them.
That's amazing. Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Thanks for telling me about that, because I think that's the first time you give me the statistics of how people are looking at it. No, that's great. And also, it's, regardless of whether students go to university or not, it's just to give them that enrichment experience, and that spatial awareness and that different way of looking at the world and getting them thinking differently. And I think that's so important. That kind of adds to that critical thinking kind of thing. Right. So before we close off, then. Do you have a couple of quick facts about you personally, like that you'd like to share?
I think this is the worst kind of question to ask, particularly academics who spend their life, see their life as their work or their work as their life. I don't know. I'm a proud owner of a rescue dog named Howard, who's a lurcher, who's a bit of a handful.
But
hello
to Howard.
Yeah, that process of we got him in October 2019, so actually it was before the pandemic hit. But I think came to very much appreciate the sort of extra company, but the routine you get of taking a dog for a walk every day is a great bit of mindfulness in a sense. It gets you out in the morning, and so I definitely that's an important part of my life, and it makes me a bit more. Makes me make sure that I get out and see places, and we're lucky here. We live near the what's called Walthamstow Marshes and stuff. So actually, even though we live in London, we have access to some really nice green space, which is incredibly important, I think.
Yeah, I know Walthamstow pretty well. I mean, I'm originally from Harlow in Essex, so my mum's from Epping, so not too far away from that part of London.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, Epping Forest is quite a few times down there. Right then, okay, so the last thing then is we are all geographers, where we link all of our podcast guests together. And you mentioned earlier on in the episode about being a bit of a hipster. And I'm not sure whether this will help with this word that Daryl Sinclair came up with last episode, which is the word dope. So dope, from his point of view, I mean, he said, because he loves breakdance, he does breakdancing and things like that. So he uses the word dope as that cultural term to mean, that's just amazing, that's brilliant, you've nailed it kind of thing. So he says you can try and approach the word dope in that manner. And I said, well, it's up to the interpretation of the receiver. So the trick is, James, you've got 30 seconds to link the word dope geographically in any way, shape or form. And you could take Daryl's context, or you can take a different context. That's entirely up to you.
Well, I don't know that this is exactly a word that I heard being used, but I definitely got that kind of sort of dope reaction from my undergraduate class the other week, a couple of weeks ago. I went into the map library in our department. We're very fortunate that we're one of the few departments left that have a big map room. And so I actually got out, a table full of maps, paper maps. And I was really taken by how engaged and excited the students were for seeing paper maps. I mean, they were taking pictures of them and I think posting stuff online of these paper maps, but many hadn't seen them before. And actually many were very surprised that they weren't made with computers. I mean, I think the latest map I showed was like in 1950s and stuff. They didn't believe me that these things were done by hand, but it was an incredibly immersive experience for them. And I did feel, I guess, dope is a word that I probably wouldn't feel comfortable using because I feel like a bit of an old man trying to sound like a cool person. But I felt like a little bit of an old man when I was showing these maps to the students, because I mean I sort of was at the transition point where the paper maps were still really important, I think, for understanding things. Even though we had GIS and that kind of stuff, it was never quite, you still get a big impact on a big paper map, but now we don't use them so much. And so it was almost a novelty, but I was really enthused by the students' reaction. They all want to come back and look at the map library again. So I'm going to try and put that in. But I definitely, there's hope still for paper maps. And I think we should still try and use them a bit, particularly when we're teaching, because they are so tactile and tangible.
Well, I'll let you go on beyond the 30 seconds of the challenge, just because that was a great story. And also, I totally get you. Well, first of all, we're about the same age, so enough with this old person nonsense.
Well, yes, no.
And and the second thing is, when someone like Daryl, comes up with the word "dope" for us white people, it's like I kind of feel like that Offspring song, we're just trying to be pretty fly for a white guy, trying to invade somebody else's culture way too much, where it's almost cringeworthy. But thank you, Daryl, for that. I know that you did that to kind of see what we would come up with. Right, so now it's your turn then. I mean, there is I could think of a potentially maybe obvious word you might choose for the next guest, but based on the discussions of this podcast episode, but it's entirely up to you, James. Have you got a word for our next guest to link to geography?
So does it have to be a word that has any links to geography, or is it just any random word?
No, any random word.
That is interesting. No, I would say the word I would use is maybe the one I was thinking of, and this is a sort of more of a geography word, but sure. I was thinking of something like connectedness or connections. Let's go with connections.
Connections. Okay,
I'd
wonderful.
Be interested to see what connections the next guest can draw with that word. Yeah,
brilliant. Well, my next guest, I believe, is actually a map maker. So quite nice.
We'll see how they go.
Flows quite nicely on from this. Well, thank you, James. So last but not least, you've already given your the Atlas of the Invisible website a plug. But is there any more shout outs? I mean, you mentioned your lovely rescue dog, but you've got any more shout outs and any other kind of promotion to give regards websites, social media, or anything like that?
No. I mean, I could say I'm on Twitter as at Spatial Analysis. If anyone wants to take a look at that, or my website is jcheshire.com. There's other materials and bits and pieces on there that people might be interested in looking at. So if you're interested in anything I've said or whatever, please reach out. My messages are open on Twitter, so people can reach me that way or find my UCL email address.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you for joining me. And once again, I'll say it's just been an absolute pleasure to collaborate with you and work with you. And good luck with all your future projects. I'm very, very excited to see what may be in that mind of yours that may be coming in the future, whether you thought about them yet or not.
Great. Thanks, Kit. And thanks for all your help with the materials as well.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you had fun. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe so more stories and experiences can drop into your favourite podcast app. If you fancy being a guest or have any feedback, follow us on Twitter at coffeegeogpod and send us a DM. Or you could email coffeeandgeog@geogramblings.com. Until next time, keep geogging.